Hi there. Warner Discovery just posted their earnings report for second quarter 2025, March to June. And we won't be getting these reports in their current form for much longer because they've announced that the company will split in two next year, but for now, there's some new info to go over as it affects us. First, of course, they announced the names for the two companies they're splitting into, but then second, they've reported their HBO Max subscriber growth after their big launch in Australia this past spring. And then last, I'm going to quickly run down the actual earnings reports results by division. I said there were 3 points. The new names of the split companies, global subscriber growth, and the division-by-division earnings report. Point 1. Keeping things simple, the new names are going to be Warner Brothers and Discovery. Well, technically it's called Discovery Global, but everyone's going to shorten it to Discovery, and to be honest, I don't care, because Westeros is in the Warner half. Well, the way that I already made a video on this, the way they said they did this is Discovery gets all of the cable channels, though production on some of these things like DC, Cartoon Network things, it's still within Warner, but they sell it to Discovery, whatever, but Discovery gets all the cable channels, plus sports and CNN. Because sports and live news are the only money generators on cable anymore because they're live. So that was the carrot that they had to give them, fair enough. So ultimately, across 20 years, the name went from Warner Brothers to Time Warner, to briefly AOL Time Warner before then changing back, to in 2018, as Game of Thrones wrapped up, Time Warner was bought by AT&T, who renamed it Warner Media, only to then sell it to Discovery, resulting in Warner Brothers Discovery, and now here we are, back in a circle 20 years later, as just plain Warner Brothers, with the streamer that was HBO Max, then Max, and now HBO Max again. Nice and simple, Warner Brothers with the streamer HBO Max. Point 2. Global subscribers to HBO Max increased by 3.4 million in the past quarter, mostly from launches in Australia and Turkey. They did say that 3.2 was international from those launches, 0.2 was from domestic. But yeah, over 3 million from the Australia and Turkey launches combined. I don't have a breakdown of how much in one or the other, so it's less than 3 million for Australia, but still a number in there. But this results in a worldwide total of 126 million subscribers for HBO Max. And consider they only broke 100 million last year. When their international spread started, again, I keep going, I research things to know why they're low on money, because after the merger, the government put a 2-year moratorium on them doing any more mergers, which means they couldn't do any more international launches. International growth fuels revenue, so that's why they didn't have a lot of money from 2022 to 2024. But then as soon as they were allowed to do that again, starting summer of 24, the money finally started coming in and they actually started recovering. That is what's going on, not single writer destroys international conglomerate. So, right now, with the 3.4 million subscribers they gained from the Australia-Turkey launches, they're now at 126 million. Stated goal is to reach 150 million by the end of 2026. After their huge launch across the Sky Atlantic zone in Europe, which includes the UK, Germany, and Italy. I'm not sure on the specifics of that. They kept saying early 2026, but I wonder, because it's different language zones, will it be in all 3 of those, plus the other countries like Ireland and Austria? Will it be in all of them at once? Will it be the UK and then a month later Germany? We don't know. A quick update that I'm splicing in here. HBO Max did say, we hope to expand to a few other local markets before the end of 2025, by which I thought they meant 1 or 2, but the dubbers groups that follow this over on Reddit just gave me the tip that when you check the HBO website, it's actually now updated for pretty much all of the other Asian countries other than the huge markets like India or Japan. I mean, places like Mongolia, even conservative Muslim countries I didn't think would get this, like Pakistan and Bangladesh. So I'll go over this more in the main video dedicated to it once we get an official announcement and a street date for all of it. One other interesting thing related to this, though, during the last expansion wave back in fall when they relaunched in Southeast Asia, I didn't get a breakdown of international versus US subscribers within that, as a pie chart, but they did now. That out of that 126 million, 58 million are in the USA, while 68 million are international. So for the first time ever, there are more HBO Max subscribers outside the USA than in it. About 46% are in the USA. Well, first time. The first time was actually probably this past spring, but I didn't get a number at the time that, thinking on it, 3 million or so isn't enough to put them over the top of a 10 million difference. The Southeast Asia launch added something like 1 or 2 more million. France-Belgium launch last summer added 6 million. I think that's what put them over the top. But whatever the case, whatever the exact point, it was some point in the second half of 2024, and certainly now, due to all of these international expansion waves, HBO Max has passed the point where it has now officially got more subscribers outside of the United States than in it. This is a global platform, unified global platform. I mean, thinking back to a decade ago, I remember so vividly how parochial it was that after Game of Thrones Season 5 in 2015, it really hit me, and I've repeated this more than once. This report came out that Brazil was the top illegal downloader country for Game of Thrones, and news sites for Game of Thrones and fan sites laughed it off as a joke. Maybe people watch this in Brazil, we don't know, we don't care. When industry news sites are trying to say, you're losing money on this, this indicates that you could be selling a streaming service in Brazil, there's demand for it, and you aren't tapping what could be a lucrative market, because there's this whole mentality of the Richard Plepler era at HBO that we don't care if international viewers are watching this. We care about... They had this whole thing about dominating U.S. culture and A-list actors to get on HBO, who in turn would win them Emmy Awards. Netflix kicked their ass and got more Emmys by the end, so that really humiliated them. And there's global celebrities on top, but they really were not concerned with international expansion. It might exist, it might not. And they think back on everything Netflix and Amazon did to become global streaming empires. So much of it was due to the short-sightedness of the old school companies at the time that just head in the sand management, they're making buggy whips in the age of the car, just refuse to see we need to make streamers and we need to spread them internationally. That's what Netflix did. It's no accident they made more money. And this feet dragging by HBO, there was no excuse. So to compete with an international scale streamer that Netflix and Amazon Prime have a global audience, that's how they are able to afford global scale budgets for their TV shows. Their top TV shows like Stranger Things, Squid Game, even Lord of the Rings. You can't afford a global scale show with something that only streams in the United States. This ties back into why did House of the Dragon, well, really Warner as a whole was having to cut budgets because they hadn't launched in the UK and Germany. They hadn't launched in France. They hadn't launched in Australia. The official number they gave last year, right before they launched in France, I think, was that compared to their potential global audience, they were operating at 60% capacity. That 60% of the global subscriber audience that might subscribe to them if it was available were, because they didn't have the UK, they didn't have Australia, they didn't have Germany. If they can actually realize that full potential, that's where the money will come in to sustain their programming, to get us our shows with more episodes. Because if you're not global scale, go home. If you're not global scale, you're the mom and pop local hardware store competing against international chain Walmart. Well, that's just from a business standpoint. From a personal standpoint, the reason I stress international growth is also just the fan sites themselves, not book fan sites. Book fan sites, the books came out decades ago, so book fandom is relatively international. Because the books came out in, 96, that by 2015, I know Westeros.org and the book fan sites would talk with the French fan site, the Spanish and Portuguese language fan sites, the Italian ones, Indonesian ones, relatively worldwide. The hype fandom that grew up around late Game of Thrones was specifically US-based. I mean, there were, global fans in other languages, don't get me wrong, making the same mistakes, but so much of this was centered around tabloid culture just for the celebrity actors. Even though Maisie Williams wasn't playing Arya anymore by season 7, she was playing herself. That the people running like Watchers on the Wall at the time, they thought they were the center of the universe. They put together a convention and held it in Tennessee of all places, because it's closer to where their site owners lived. As opposed to, this is a show that films in the UK and Spain. HBO's headquarters is in New York, where I am, and that's where a lot of the reporters live. At least you can make the argument, well, this is where the reporters live. I kind of like to make that argument, but middle of the US, that's not even where most of us lived, so just how much they ignored the international fans. Because they couldn't control them. That's another thing. Why would they want to share resources with people they couldn't dominate because of a language barrier? So every time I bring up the international spread, it's really for two reasons. The primary one, don't get me wrong, the primary one is this is the business survival is hinging on this. It makes sense that they need these international launches to fuel all of their projects. But on a second private personal note, this is always my screw you to Watchers on the Wall, that you really didn't care that people were watching this in Brazil, in Germany, in high numbers. That it's because we're all that matters. And just how it was a click, fandom clicks happen, that just how that is not what we wanted. The book fandom wasn't like that. You can say the book fandom is elitist, but at least it was international. From fans all over the place, because, it's slower and more patient, versus I'm making Twitter posts in English about Maisie Williams. So, internationalization is the future. It's one big global fandom. Like, Star Wars doesn't think of itself as an American show or project anymore. It's a global franchise. It belongs to the world. And to survive, it needs to be a global franchise in terms of the scale it's at. Point 3. The actual numbers from the report. Nothing too drastic, that Warner continues to dig itself out from the financial hole that it fell into at the cable apocalypse. Remember I said a couple of reports ago, by New Year's, I was stunned at how well their end-of-year quarter did, because to his credit, Zaslav managed to cut a lot of things, do a lot of internal things, but they managed to turn around the debt, and they're selling off the cable networks. So maybe that's a good thing that he managed to do that. That, surprise, because the international rollouts are fueling everything, but the story of this past year has been, by 6 months into it, by New Year's, Warner was doing a lot better, and continues to do better. Just this second quarter report's just continuing that trend of things are looking up. Relative to first quarter, first 3 months, overall raw revenue and profit rose slightly, but by division, studios experienced a large increase due to the success of Minecraft and, surprisingly, the Sinners movie. R-rated, I didn't think it'd be that big, but if you're one of the two people who actually watched my last report on this, I said Minecraft comes out the week after the cutoff on first quarter, and we know it'll be a hit, so wait for the boost that gives. Even I was surprised at how much of a boost, though, that I'm just putting the numbers on screen. I'm not going to waste time reading them all, but not from a raw revenue standpoint, but from a net profit standpoint. Movie Studios division tripled in profit in the past quarter, relative to first quarter. Due to the Minecraft movie and Sinners, they were real hits. Though cable networks and direct-to-consumer experienced a slight dip relative to first quarter, but I've said in other reports, it's not really fair to compare things quarter one to quarter two sequentially. You need to compare them because there's certain shows that come out in spring, or your sports content, or your fall premieres. You need to compare one fall to the next fall. So Q2 2024, Q2 2025. Studios did even better compared to spring of 2024. Studios quadrupled in profit. So it's all due that they had a better movie roster this year. Also because last year they didn't have Dune, the year before they did. Relative to a full year ago, so this is quarter two of last year, streaming division direct-to-consumer actually did have a slight increase in raw revenue. We're talking 2.5, 2.8 billion. But profit is where you see the real difference. Because as I've covered before, 2024 was the year that streaming became profitable for them for the first time ever. Particularly later in the year, because remember, first half of 2024 was a rain shadow of the writer's strike, ripple effects of the writer's strike. There were very few shows on prior to June of 2024 when House of the Dragon came out, and they had all these heavy hitters pretty late in the year, like Penguin, Dune Prophecy. So most of that was from the end of the year, just the way it all stacked up like that. But they were negative. They were in debt, the streaming division, in terms of raw profit. Q2 of 2024. This year it's only getting better. And, from a negative 107 to positive 293 million. And the other trend you're seeing is that cable networks are, of course, still dying and continuing to die with no hope of ever turning back. That 25% less profit than a year ago. That is a rapid decline. And yeah, out of almost $2 billion in total combined profit, networks is 3/4 of that. But when you look at the growth rates, it's ridiculous. They need to get rid of this like the rotten apple that it is. You have to chuck it out before it pulls everyone down. That also between first and second quarters, profits for cable dropped from 1.8 to 1.5 billion. If the quarter-to-quarter decline is steady, that they're losing 300 million per quarter on cable, they will actually not be turning any profit on it at all in a year and a half. Or if we go by the annual decline, that, year to year it's dropping 25%. You're talking like at best 4 years, and it'll snowball. It won't be like that. It'll be exponential decline. Because the cable apocalypse happened in 2024, that the distributors that they were basically, blackmailing and pressuring into keep paying us pre-streaming money said, we can't keep doing that. So that's what the house of cards fell apart, as it were. And everything suddenly rapidly declined, rug pulled out from under them, and suddenly cable is declining double digits every quarter. That's why it happened this fast, and why they are jumping ship, and just, if Discovery wants it, fine, we will be losing money on that division within 2 years. Fair enough. I'm not sure if video games are counted as direct-consumer yet, that there's this whole thing that under the old regime, it was part of studios, which I think is a better idea, because it's released like a movie, long development cycle. Video games are now considered part of the direct-to-consumer division with streaming. There's not really news to report now, because they're in the middle of a development cycle. There weren't any giant video game releases in the past 2 quarters, but I've made other report videos on they are planning new major video game projects. Just, they're not going to be out for like a year or 2, so there wasn't really much movement on the video game front, so I don't think that really affected anything. By the time video game releases start coming out again, that'll be after next summer when they've dropped cable. Maybe that they'll turn video games into a separate top-tier division again. I don't know. So, that about wraps things up for now. The clickbaiters were not paying attention to this, that they have recovered. That they spent, a year less, because it was only really for the first few weeks, clickbaiting, these writers are terrible, when it was an industry-wide problem. And I explained why it was an industry-wide problem, and why recovery was happening with the international launches, with dropping the dead weight of the cable networks.